You ready to go?
We're just gonna give it one more minute. Just
Okay.
making sure the chat is working. I should have turned on the chat to everybody. Um, so yeah, it should be working now.
Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kathy Abbott. I'm the president and CEO here at Boston Harbor Now. And we have been convening harbor use forums for a long time. The purpose is to engage all of us in public discussions about what's happening on the waterfront. If it's your first time here at a harbor use forum, welcome. If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And it's really meant to be an interesting and engaging way to learn about new developments, new plans, new ideas that are taking place that are helping to shape our waterfront. And it's an opportunity, it's a place for presenters to share in a really safe and engaging environment, and for all the rest of us to engage with questions, ideas, responses, to help to further shape the things that are happening. So thanks to all the presenters who are here today. We have a terrific lineup, and to all of you who are attending. We really want to thank the Boston Waterfront Partners who have put together this study, of which we are a part. It's a real honor to be able to help get this rolled out in this format. The study is Strengthening the Urban Harbor, Policy and Investment Recommendations for Boston Working Ports. And this is going to be the first of a three-part series that we're going to be doing here on the Harbor Use Forum on designated port areas. So excited to have our panelists here, very grateful, excited to have all of you here, and looking forward to the conversation that follows. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you,
Back to you,
Kathy.
Kel.
Thank you. As Kathy mentioned, today we're going to learn more about the Boston Waterfront Partner study, Strengthening the Urban Harbor, Policy and Investment Recommendations for Boston's Working Ports, which is a bit of a mouthful, but is descriptive. This report outlines the challenges that designated port areas face and identifies strategies to ameliorate these threats, and offers ways that DPAs can better serve the local communities they reside within. Before we dive into the presentation and subsequent panel, we'd like to do a couple of quick polls to learn more about the folks here in the room today. So I'm going to launch a poll in just a second. So hopefully everyone can see this on screen, and we'll report back what the results are in just a second. I want to give everyone an opportunity to fill in the poll. Alrighty, gonna give it just a few more seconds. Alrighty. So thank you all for filling out the poll. Most people are very familiar with designated port areas. They understand the opportunities and challenges affiliated with them. A number of people are somewhat familiar, and we have a few people who are excited to learn more about them. Most people are coming from walking distance within a port. They're very familiar with them, or like live sort of in the general area of Boston, Everett, Chelsea, or Revere, which is where our study area is located. And yeah, we appreciate everyone for coming if you are located pretty centrally where we are having the study, and also if you are coming from further afield. So, for the uninitiated, designated port areas, aka DPAs, are, according to mass.gov, land and water areas with certain physical and operational features that have been identified to have state, regional, and national significance with respect to the promotion of water-dependent industrial uses and commercial activities that rely on marine transportation or withdrawal or discharge of large volumes of water. That is essentially to say they're areas specifically zoned by the state for the working waterfront. If you are an industrial land use that doesn't need access to the water to function, then these spaces are not meant for you, hypothetically speaking. If you are even not an industrial land use and you don't need the water, these spaces are really just meant for industrial waterfront uses. Despite the zoning, DPAs and working waterfronts are still highly vulnerable to developmental pressure and climate change impacts. With this in mind, the Boston Waterfront Partners commissioned this working waterfront study because we wanted to better understand how to support the working waterfront in light of the developmental pressure and resilience challenges it faces, how to maximize the benefits of it, and how to address past and minimize future impacts for local communities who host them. This study complements the Office of Coastal Zone Management, also known as CZM, their designated port area study. Their study, like ours, asks similar questions, but is focused on the whole of Massachusetts. Our geographic scope is much smaller, allowing us to dive deeper into the opportunities and challenges within Boston Harbor and make this more targeted recommendations. Today, we'll be joined by Alex Meeks, Principal HR&A and author of the Boston Waterfront Partner Study. Alex will be providing more context on the Boston's Inner Harbor DPAs, highlighting some of the most pressing challenges for these DPAs and sharing an overview of the report's findings. After Alex's presentation, we'll move on to a panel with members of the Boston Waterfront Partners who commissioned the study and helped inform the DPA study. After I get to ask all of my questions as host, we'll open up the forum and take questions from the audience. This is a pretty packed agenda, so on that note, Alex, take it away.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction, Kelly. Go ahead and share my screen. All right. So Kelly already gave us a really great introduction into what designated port areas are and how they work. And so I'm going to try to speed past that portion of it and really get to some of the meat of the Boston Waterfront Partners report that Kelly mentioned. So I'll start with just a quick introduction that kind of treads on the ground that Kelly already walked over for us. Walk through some challenges facing designated port areas across the Boston's Inner Harbor today, and highlight some sample strategies that the Boston Waterfront Partners report articulated about trying to strengthen the working port while also protecting the communities that host them. So, I think we're all kind of asking the question in a time of climate change, hazards mounting, and sort of levels of public investment coming into question. What would it take to adapt Boston's Inner Harbor city ports to sort of help modernize them and bring them up to speed when it comes to modern today's economic needs, but also so that they can heed environmental justice concerns that have long gone unaddressed and other questions. As Kelly mentioned, designated port areas were created and sort of under the governance of the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management, Mass CZM. CZMs across the country, most coastal states have a CZM, were created in the 1970s to do various coastal zone management after the federal government decided it didn't want to do it. And the Massachusetts CZM was relatively unique in its decision to take on the regulation of maritime industrial land across the state, and ultimately formed 10 DPAs, 4 of which are located within the Boston's Inner Harbor here. Other DPAs of note include the Salem offshore wind port terminal up north, which has benefited from a considerable amount of investment between the state and a wind energy developer, generating a lot of jobs and a really healthy community benefits agreement that's really putting money into everything from workforce housing to infrastructure improvements in and around the port, to the New Bedford DPA, which is hosting an offshore wind training center. I won't go into too much detail, but as Kelly mentioned, DPAs are meant to set aside land for water-dependent industrial uses, and it limits or completely prohibits non-industrial uses and uses that may be industrial in nature but do not need access to water. Now, there is some wiggle room here, and you're going to see in a second a lot of examples of non-water dependent uses that have been permitted for various reasons in these DPAs, and I'll walk through that in a second. But who organizes, who governs, who invests in DPAs? So as I mentioned earlier, Massachusetts CZM kind of is responsible for this land at the highest level. And Mass DEP works together with them to review licenses as under the Chapter 91 of Massachusetts general laws, reviews licenses to operate your business here or make alterations to your land use here. Now, that is sort of a regulatory set of responsibilities. When it comes to economic development, business planning, infrastructure investment, there hasn't really for a while been a single institution responsible for that. Relatively recently, the Seaport Economic Council was convened and then reenacted or reestablished even more recently, tasked with issuing grants to nonprofit and public sector organizations seeking to do economic development in maritime and industries that sort of sought to benefit ports. But this was a relatively limited amount of money per year, relatively limited amount of resources for staff time. And beyond this, there hasn't really been a unified economic development stakeholder responsible for the future of DPAs and the health economically of DPAs. And perhaps as a result, Boston's working waterfronts, at least those within DPAs, have benefited from very different levels of public investment and have, as a result, taken different paths over the last few decades. And then we're really going to be focusing on these four here, starting with the South Boston DPA in orange, then the sort of Mystic River DPA here in jade, green, the Chelsea Creek DPA in red, and finally the smallest of the DPAs, the East Boston DPA, which is a series of disconnected chunks along the East Boston waterfront here. And unlike sort of city ports in other cities like Los Angeles or even parts of New York City, really only the South Boston DPA is sort of overseen by a singular entity, Massport. The other DPAs are overwhelmingly composed of private property owners that do not have a sort of shared formal governance entity combining them or connecting them together. So starting with the South Boston DPA, this is the second largest DPA in Boston and has benefited from a considerable amount of federal, state, and some private investment. As I mentioned earlier, Massport is a significant landowner here and operates the Conley Container Terminal, which is, I think, the only sort of terminal of its scale and size in New England, and they sort of across the water, the Flynn Cruise Port, which serves tourism vessels. You see a lot of industrial and water-dependent industrial uses around the northern part of this the DPA. This map is flipped, and you see a few examples of commercial property development on the margins of DPAs, sort of red here, for example, and on the upper floors of certain industrial uses, like in a marine industrial terminal park, which I'll get to later. These were permitted by Massport or as temporary uses if a property owner was able to sort of prove that a water-dependent industrial use couldn't be positioned there as required by the DEP license. And here are just some images showing the sheer scale of the Conley container terminal, as well as the Flynn cruise port terminal, cruise port just across the water. Next, we have the largest of the DPAs in Boston's Inner Harbor, the Mystic River DPA. And you're going to see a lot more variation with respect to land uses here. On this sort of portion of the DPA within the Charlestown neighborhood in Boston, you see sort of a significant amount of parking right along the water related to vehicle transportation on the water. You also see Mass CEC's Wind Testing Technology Center, where they test wind blades and other technologies in a large-scale facility. On the Everett side, there is a legacy of energy storage and energy generation assets, some of which are still operating and some of which are not. In this uppermost northern corner here, you see the Mystic River Generating Station, which, as I'll get to later, is really now going to be transformed into a soccer stadium as part of a deal allowed by the state late last year as part of a larger economic development bill, which has really catalyzed a lot of the conversation about how do we protect and make decisions about the use of land and the protection of land in these DPAs. And as I mentioned, the Mystic River Generating Station, another view of it over here, but you're also seeing a lot of non-water dependent uses. For instance, an Amazon fulfillment center on the Everett side, which is certainly industrial in nature, but isn't really connecting to that water dependent requirement. sort of another example of a temporary use, but it's a use that's supportive, I think, of some of the maritime-related shipping uses. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Mass CEC Wind Technology Testing Center, which is definitely qualifies as a use that's compliant due to the nature of the offshore wind energy as a permitted use in DPAs, according to Chapter 91. Here we have Chelsea Creek DPA. And while all DPAs are really centers of economic development that has some trade-offs in terms of emissions of vehicles coming in and out of the DPA, emissions from boats that are sort of parked or sort of temporarily staying at dock. The Chelsea Creek DPA is really distinguishes itself by the level of sort of environmental justice challenges here. Just to the north, the city of Chelsea, Massachusetts, really shows up, and I'll have a slide on this later on, in the highest levels of environmental justice concern as reported by the EPA. And you're seeing a lot of sort of legacy fuel storage right on the water here. For instance, the Gulf Oil Terminal right on the water here. And its proximity to the airport and major interstates means that there are a ton of trucks coming in and out of this DPA at all points in time. You see here right on the water, the legacy fuel oil drums that just have, a legacy of contamination stuck underground that could be dislodged in the event of a flood, for instance. Here you have a pre-flight parking lot, an example of a temporary use that doesn't really connect to the water-dependent nature of the DPA. And on the right, you have a photo of Eastern Salt, which is a water-dependent use and is sort of responsible for all the salt you see on the roads before it snows, right? And they need that ship-to-shore access for transporting that salt, that inventory, in and out of their parcel. And finally, the East Boston DPA, a sort of disconnected parcels up and down the river, or up and down the harbor, that really is abutting a neighborhood in change. Sort of affordable housing is a massive topic citywide, but in East Boston, housing prices have skyrocketed, and there is a lot of concern about the tension between sort of this overwhelmingly residential district and the industrial uses right on the water. You're seeing conflict between trucks driving in and out of these purple areas, these red areas, and the tight pedestrian-focused streets further inland. Here's a shot of the Boston Harbor Shipyard and Marina, which is a designated port area use, but really is an example of how you might blend sort of publicly accessible uses while still meeting DPA regulations. So I kind of began to allude to some of the challenges facing DPAs today, but I think this tension between insatiable real estate development demand and the set aside of DPA land is really coming to a head. In the last few years, gross rent has increased substantially in the communities that are hosting DPAs. Chelsea increased rents 35%, Everett rents increased 67%, East Boston rents skyrocketed 70% between 2017 and 2022. I would have mentioned the Seaport neighborhood here, except it didn't really gentrify. It was just created and immediately became this extremely high income, high rent neighborhood. And that's really leading to this conversation about the value of waterfront land as a place to put additional housing, as a place to put additional public access, and potentially diminishing permanently the land that is set aside by the state for water-dependent industrial uses that can't just go anywhere. And that's just a really tricky trade-off. And you're seeing that sort of behind this state economic development bill I mentioned earlier, where as a part of this bill, the legislature went around formal Massachusetts CZM and DEP processes for redesignating the boundaries of DPA. They went around that process by using a bill to just remove the DPA designation from a corner of the Mystic River DPA and enable the development of a soccer stadium and a waterfront park. And one of the terms of that deal was for CZM to do a study on DPAs Luckily, they were already doing it, and that study will come out in June. Climate hazards are also a grave concern for industrial waterfronts along the Boston Harbor, but also just for the Boston Harbor generally. You're seeing substantial, almost all of the South Boston's DPA is sort of very vulnerable to flooding. And this is assuming 2070 flood depth predictions by mass CZM for a 100-year storm event, or an event that happens once every 100 years. Likewise, you're seeing substantial vulnerability up and down East Boston, the Chelsea Creek waterfront. And again, there's this danger of sort of historical contaminants being unlocked and dislodged and spread inland by a flooding event, and up and down the Mystic River DPA as well. And definitely the economic and environmental trade-offs of hosting a DPA. Now, DPAs are important economic engines, especially the South Boston DPA. They provide jobs and sort of fiscal revenue to the city and state, but to the communities immediately hosting them, immediately adjacent to them, they're posing freight emissions, the proximity to potentially hazardous chemicals that could be dislodged during flood events, and they're imposing a lack of waterfront access. And these negative externalities might, from a statewide perspective, balance out some of the economic benefits of DPAs, but for the communities immediately adjacent to them, where you might not have a job in the DPA, but you have to deal with the vehicle traffic in and out, the emissions, the trade-off doesn't necessarily make sense for you. And finally, just a lack of overarching consensus or planning about the future of DPAs. The last time a really holistic look happened at DPAs, it was a combination or a collaboration between the Boston Planning and Development Agency, at that point it was called the Boston Redevelopment Authority, alongside Massport, to produce an economic development plan that looked at the future of maritime sectors in the Boston region, and thought through investments needed to grow the fisheries industry, and investments needed to expand the capacity of the South Boston DPA. And that planning really underwrote a lot of the major infrastructure investment that enabled the growth of the port over the last few decades. But something like that has not happened since. And so I'm going to try to speed up because we want to make sure we get to the panel, but wanted to highlight a few of the things that we did in order to think through strategies for modernizing and supporting and strengthening the ports here. And in addition to a lot of analysis of existing conditions and talking to a lot of stakeholders, we held virtual focus groups with experts, and also convened community members who lived in East Boston and Everett and Chelsea, who lived next to DPAs, who were curious about them and who were willing to share their experience of them living beside them. And we had a great conversation. We provided some tasty dinner, talked to 23 people who lived near these DPAs, and heard from them their sort of experience with living near DPAs and their dreams for what DPAs might be able to include for them. And for the most part, I think people really were not opposed to the existence of DPAs as such. They understood the economic importance that these areas had, but they were asking questions about how we could better moderate the environmental hazards associated with them. How could we better balance industrial development investment that brought businesses to the area and jobs to the area with protections against displacement? And how could we produce job opportunities that are actually open to people who live near DPAs, with workforce development supports, apprenticeship programs, better transportation to facilitate commuting in and out of DPAs that would make these jobs more accessible to the people who are living across the street, so to speak. And of course, I encourage you to look through the full report if you have time to look through all of the strategies that the Boston Waterfront Partners put together. But just as a sampler, we thought a lot more about how might we build workforce pipeline that connect local talent, including talent in environmentally and economically vulnerable communities, to really high quality, high paying jobs with economic mobility potential in Boston's city ports. And we looked closely at some of the assets already doing this work in Massachusetts, as well as examples of ways to start early and engage youth as early as middle and high school, for instance, with the New York Harbor School, in thinking about themselves, imagining themselves in these maritime jobs. We also looked through creative ways of balancing non-traditional and traditional water-dependent industrial development in DPAs. We were experiencing or hearing a lot of frustration from maritime business owners about the proliferation of temporary uses that were either sort of not well maintained or just did not sort of follow the letter of the law when it came to water dependence. Yet we also heard from a lot of maritime industrial property owners that the regulations on what they were allowed to do on their parcels were so restrictive that sometimes they were prevented or impeded from generating additional revenue for their businesses. And so we looked at examples in Tacoma and Seattle, as well as New York, to understand how, on a sort of a geographic way, the cities or port authorities had allowed certain property owners more flexibility, preserving maritime industrial uses on the ground floor or in the majority of the parcel, while allowing the second floor to sort of have a higher revenue use that would kind of cross-subsidize that first floor maritime use. And you see an example of this actually in the Flynn Marine Terminal in the South Boston DPA, where Massport has effectively done that. You have marine uses on the first floor, and then uses like design and architecture firms on the second floor that pay a higher rent. And finally, we thought through a sort of a multi-level investment plan for DPAs in order to make sure that a significant level of state and, fingers crossed, federal investment makes it to these DPAs. There's a lot of capital out there, including private capital, for helping a business make a clean energy transition. And so rather than flooding it with even more capital, we suggested just making connections between small business development centers, the federal government, DOE, and maritime businesses and the industries, the organizations that represent them, to make sure that these businesses get help putting together financial plans and accessing affordable, appropriate capital to make transitions and reduce their operating costs long term. We also learned from contexts like New York City, where there are small grants available to help small business owners jumpstart their own investments in property-specific or asset-level resilience. So get a free inspection by an engineer to understand what you might need to do to protect your assets from flooding, and get a $5,000 starter grant or potentially larger starter grant to elevate some equipment, for instance, as a step in the right direction. But really, nothing will take, nothing can replace the role of major public infrastructure investment. The scale of this flood vulnerability is massive, as you saw on the map, and so we need a massive commensurate level of investment. We were excited to see that MassWorks, the state's economic development bond program, was renewed as part of the bill last year. And we're really encouraging MassWorks to work with the Seaport Economic Council to steer a lot of that financing investment into investments in the DPAs that help multiple property owners protect themselves from climate hazards. We also saw potential in continuing to look at what happens at the EPA. During the last Trump administration, the EPA Brownfields program actually got more funding. And so there might or might not be opportunity there. And so, here's just a QR code for accessing the report on your smartphone. We can also send around a URL to access the report later on. But I want to make sure that we have time for our thoughtful panelists. So I'll wrap up and hand it, I think, back to Shelley.
Thanks, Alex. That was super helpful. It was a really excellent overview of the study, and we appreciate your time and expertise on the matter. I know people in the audience likely have some questions about Alex's presentation, but I want to transition us over to the panel because some of your questions may be answered in our discussion today with the Boston Waterfront Partners. So quick overview, the Boston Waterfront Partners are a coalition of nonprofit and community-based organizations dedicated to the sustainable development and equitable use of Boston's waterfront areas. Boston Harbor Now, along with Conservation Law Foundation, Save the Harbor, Save the Bay, GreenRoots, and other organizations are part of this coalition. There are a number of issues that we universally care about, including parks, programmings, policy, and most relevantly to this conversation, the working waterfront. Having said that, we all come from different organizations which have different perspectives, values, and priorities. As such, when we're talking of a working waterfront, we may not always be in perfect agreement with each other. So with this in mind, we ask all the panelists and attendees to be open-minded about the conversation we're having, and be respectful of everyone's opinions, even if they're not ones that you share. So, Alex, would you mind stopping sharing your screen? Thank you. So with this in mind, could we have all the panelists introduce themselves with names, organizations, titles, and preferred pronouns? Breanne, let's start with you and then go to Jason, and last but not least, John.
Hi, everybody. My name's Breanne Frank. I'm an associate attorney at Conservation Law Foundation, specifically in our waterways program. My pronouns are she, they.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Rundle. I lead the policy team at Save the Harbor, Save the Bay, and I use he, him pronouns.
And I guess it's still morning. Good morning, everyone. John Walkey. I'm the Director of Climate Justice and Waterfront Initiatives at GreenRoots, environmental justice nonprofit. We're based in Chelsea, and we work in Chelsea and East Boston. And I'm an East Boston resident, he, him pronouns.
Great. Thank you all for being here. As MC, I give the honor of asking our panelists my 3 questions first, but then at the end, I want to open it up to the broader community, invite them to virtually raise their hand or put a question in the chat. We do not have the Q&A section right now because I want people to use the chat so everyone can see the questions being asked. So at the end of this, put your questions in the chat. All right, John, I have a question for you. Why should people care about designated port areas and the working waterfront?
Well, I'll say why they should care about the working waterfront, because it was there before DPAs were. My grandfather was an immigrant to East Boston, came from a small fishing village in Nova Scotia, and when he got here in the first couple of years of the 20th century, he found his work on the waterfront. He worked as a fish cutter and eventually would go on to work at the GE. And he married a woman who was an Italian immigrant, and her father first got his job here in East Boston working as a welder in the shipyard. So the working waterfront really meant jobs for people in the community. That was what the waterfront was. Why people today should care about it when people are working, remotely. They're working, in their pajamas in their home office or whatever. Why should they care about the waterfront? And that answer is sort of tied up in 2 big changes that we have happening right now with us. And one of them is that inexorable sort of market churn of going through, having gone to undergrad. I remember when getting an apartment in Jamaica Plain was like a very easy thing, and now it's expensive. My brother got a condo that was a studio apartment in the North End. It was $900 a month, and my parents were scandalized. You have a hard time finding parking for $900 a month. So obviously things change. And the last 20, 30 years or so, things have changed a lot. And just that alone, the market pressures and the real estate dynamics of everything would be enough for a large conversation and lots of arguing and whatnot. But we have sort of overlaid on top of that the other change that really is why this matters to everyone, and that's the climate change aspect. That these waterfront parcels are very much on the front line of what's going to happen as we are seeing sea levels rise, as we see sunny day flooding is like a regular occurrence. And more importantly, when we get these heavy rainfall events, we have a lot of stormwater flooding that's quickly coming down through a paved watershed straight into our pipes and straight out into our rivers and into the harbor, at the same time that if this is a coastal storm, we might have a surge that's filling up those pipes with seawater coming in. And so the amount of flooding that we can expect to see is pretty major. And when we are thinking about planning for the East Boston area, we're currently, and over in Chelsea, we're working along the Mill Creek, which runs right along the Riviera Beach Parkway, which we are looking at the drawings of the original layout of Revere Beach Parkway, and we're talking about the late 19th century, and the road hasn't changed since then. A lot of our infrastructure that was laid down in that time period is still here. So when we talk about the infrastructure we're going to lay down on the waterfront now, are we thinking that kind of time frame? Are we thinking 100 years out? Are we thinking just 20 years out, or just the 4 or 5 years it takes me to build this thing and unload it before it floods? Like, those dynamics all come into play. And for folks in East Boston and Chelsea, it really is a push and pull between. It's a really interesting compare and contrast of looking at how municipal government approaches this thing called the DPA, which is sort of dumped on them. How do we deal with our own urban planning in this context? And you sort of have two examples. And in Boston, that fragmentary nature of the East Boston DPAs indicates very well how the city of Boston, the planning department in particular, how they've gone about it, which is, screw it, who cares? Eat away at it and develop the waterfront as much as possible, because that tax revenue is important. The development is important. And we are now seeing the kinds of conflicts that Alex had mentioned in terms of trying to get a large tractor trailer trucks down these little streets and like sideswiping cars and whatnot. So the zoning that a city does and the kind of restrictions that the state puts on need to be in communication with each other, or you'll get those conflicts. In Chelsea, there's a different kind of approach where we're seeing an embrace of an industrial nature that is a legacy from decades, century past. How do we make that zoning work, the adjacent zoning work with the waterfront zoning, to provide something that provides tax revenue to the city, but then also let's explore ways that we can find jobs for people who actually live here so they can stay here. And I think as of now, I think one of the only manufacturing businesses in Boston, one of the few left, is the Boston Boat Works over in Charlestown, which does actually serves as sort of a model, like the ideal of what you'd like to see. Of course, there's not like you can fill up the entire Boston Harbor with people who are producing yachts, but they do bring on people and train them and give them really well-paid jobs, crafts kind of jobs, something that harkens back to what my grandfather would have been looking for when he got here. There's very few opportunities like that because of the economic changes that have taken place. So the challenge that's laid out before us are these different axes of interests. How do we align, business and economic interests with development interests, with actual resilience interests of how do we keep this stuff stable, at least for the next 50 or 60 years? And what is, if we really want to be forward thinking, what's our fallback position as the inevitable happens? Because I think it's safe to say, no matter what kind of seawall you're going to put there, you better bet on getting wet. It's going to happen. So let's not beat around the bush about that conversation, but let's have a real conversation about it. So those are all some of the reasons why I think this issue, people should care about it.
So climate, jobs, economics, politics, zoning, basically like anything that you can imagine. And these are all the reasons why we thought commissioning the study was important. But also we kind of felt like DPAs needed a little bit extra support right now because of these sort of pressures that you were talking about, John. Jason and Breanne, what do you think are the most pressing issues currently facing Boston's designated port areas?
Yeah, I can hop in. Thanks, Kelly. So I think the most pressing issue that I'm seeing is kind of a lack of a common language and baseline economic data to talk about these spaces. When we convene as a waterfront partners and kind of also bring in maritime businesses, there's really competing narratives, whether the current land within DPAs is in demand, whether whether there's new kind of industries coming into these places. And so I see a big gap in terms of needs assessments, both at a state level and also very localized level as well. We've been really focusing on how the DPAs in the Inner Harbor are very different, as Alex alluded to, but the social fabric and histories of the DPAs as a state, whether it's Gloucester, New Bedford, are also very different from each other. So yes, we do need kind of a blanket economic demand assessment of these spaces, but also more localized needs assessments in terms of what each municipality, that has a DPA needs. And I think once we get kind of a better understanding of the current and projected demand for these spaces, it'll really help us kind of have a common baseline to really talk about how we're going to address these issues. And I think without that kind of economic analysis and study, we really just get more like anecdotal, parcel-based kind of feedback from the stakeholders we're talking to. And so I think this like baseline data gathering really is kind of what I see as a really pressing need. And I can list off a few more, but I'll give Breanne a chance to answer as well.
I mean, to expand on what Jason was saying, the foundation of what DPAs are and our protections for our working waterfronts has not really been reevaluated since the 70s. And this lack of forum for planning and for revisiting the legal and the policy landscape for our working waterfronts has led to such a disinvestment in these industries and has led to a lot of additional and honestly often unnecessary tensions between the working waterfront, the housing developers, policymakers. All of these interested parties need to have a seat at the table to say, this is what we want our land to look like. This is what we want our working waterfront to look like. And community members need to have a seat at the table, developers, people who work on the waterfront, organizations that protect our waterfronts. Everybody needs to be able to convey their ideas, their priorities. And right now that forum just doesn't exist. And I think that that's leading to a compounding of all of these problems.
Thank you, guys. Jason, if you had anything else that you wanted to share, feel free to. Otherwise, it's all good.
Yeah, I'll just hop in real quick and echo what Breanne just said, right? We haven't looked at these regulations in about 50 years. And if that's kind of the cadence that we're gonna look at for the future, this is a really amazing opportunity we find ourselves now, is we need to make significant changes. To John's point, these areas will flood. They're the most flooding vulnerable places in our cities, and they present asphalt, concrete flood pathways directly into some of our most vulnerable communities. And so there couldn't be a better time to talk about this issue. And we have to get it right this time, because we don't have another 50 years to try again and maybe widen the process, get the stakeholder engagement we need. This is such a golden opportunity, and I think I'm happy we're having this conversation now, but we have to do it right this time.
It needs to be forward looking, not just looking at the current landscape and where we've been lagging behind. We need to look forward to the climate impacts we're facing and to those projected future needs as well.
That is great. So, looking forward, what recommendations are you most excited for that come out of this study, or are there any recommendations not covered in the study that you want to see implemented for designated port areas?
I think the obvious thing is that people don't necessarily want to see more. We want more conversation, but it can't just be conversation. We need to see some actual action taking place. And I think anything that puts, and obviously right now in this day and age that we're living in, funding coming from Washington is now not, you just hope the government's still there. But we are looking for there to be some sort of funding source for those property owners. And I'm thinking mainly on the, we've got sort of we're working mostly with small private property owners who don't necessarily have hugely deep pockets to say, yeah, I can put up a $30 million, investment in this property that does not bring in that amount of money every year. The economics have to make sense. So any funding that could support the design implementation of some protection. I know for the city of Boston, they're working on like trying to coordinate with a bunch of private property owners along the border street area to do the design and at least provide that first step. But then once it comes time to actually implement that design, that's when you're talking real money. So grant programs, things that could help people write grants to get the federal money, things that could help identify funding sources for this. How can we make this happen? And with the idea that this is, how do we make this happen for something that is not going to be just a residential condo development, which obviously has a lot of revenue at this point in time. I think we need to have this conversation and say that model, oh, it's a private developer, they'll pay for these investments. That has to be tempered with the fact of what is the time period that we're talking about going forward, because they're not going to be able to pay for this in the long run if the properties are underwater, or they can't be insured, or they are in such a precarious situation, the value of the property goes down. So I think it's a challenge to figure out how do you invest large amounts of money in something that ostensibly in the market is not worth a lot of money as industrial. How do we make that have worth?
Jason, I feel like you're going to have a lot to expand on the economic piece if you want to go before me.
Sure, thanks, Breanne. Yeah, there's a few different recommendations in the HR&A report that I'm really excited about. I think the idea of bolstering the Seaport Economic Council as a convening space for all the different stakeholders in this kind of arena is really exciting, because that's a big gap that we've identified. Just the communication between communities, waterfront industrial business owners, as well as developers. I think that kind of space is really important. But like I mentioned, which is also a recommendation in the report, if we don't have like baseline economic analysis and quantified projected demand, then that those conversations can only go so far. So again, I'll press on the data piece as a key to this. I think what Alex mentioned earlier in terms of the state stepping up to fund climate resilience is a really important part of this. I didn't grow up in Boston, but I've realized that Boston can and does take on really big projects, and we've done it well in the past. And that's what it's going to take for, DPAs to be truly future focused, and climate resilience is going to take a push, like the Boston Harbor cleanup or like the Big Dig that, really does, massive public investments in this infrastructure is going to be necessary. And so I think that can't be stressed enough that, if we want these areas to be viable moving forward, it's going to take significant state investment. And then to the point about federal investment, I think DPAs are kind of unique in the fact that we can speak about them in a language that might appeal to this federal administration. Having manufacturing and industry in the U.S. is a priority for the federal government. And so I think we can increase our public access in specific cases, as well as community benefits while receiving federal and state money for this. That's the hope that I have.
I echo everything that John and Jason just said, and I'm not going to reiterate any of it because y'all don't need to hear it again. I think that from my perspective and from CLF's perspective, there's two really critical suggestions that come out of this report that I would prioritize above the others, although all of them are important. The first is, yes, prioritizing resiliency. There are so few legal protections or legal requirements to have resiliency measures in developments at the state level right now. It's just not in the laws and the regs. And I think that if we're going to be looking at how we're shaping our working waterfronts, having resiliency be front and center in the regulatory reform we might have to go through will be really critical to preserving these resources for the coming decades, centuries, etc. And to reiterate again, that needs funding. That needs support from the state, from the municipalities. Developers on their own should not be the only people investing in the resiliency of our state's resources. The other really critical thing that I'm excited about is the potential to reevaluate what our working waterfront looks like. What is marine industry these days? What is our cultural identity on our waterfronts? And what industries might be up and coming that we as a state can really look to take the lead on and prioritize? How does this differ from the Inner Harbor DPAs to New Bedford to Salem? What are the different cultural identities of our many, many towns and cities along the coast? And then along with that, how do we utilize transitional zones that Alex described in his presentation to say, okay, along the waterfront, we are going to have these very specific industry heavy uses, or these uses that really need the water itself, such as commercial fishing. And then as we ease from the waterfront back towards non-DPA areas, how do we transition to less intensive industry? And how do we transition so that it's not a sharp line from industrial use to residential? How do we make it so that a high school isn't right up against natural gas storage and a generator and all of these other things? Because that's just poor land use planning, and we need to have transitional zones to make sure that we are not putting people directly next to pollution, and to make sure that these areas aren't a hard line restricting us from accessing the waterway. So those are the things I'm most excited about.
All right, well, thank you guys so much for answering my questions. I'd love to open it to anyone in the audience. As you're asking your questions, feel free to direct it to a specific person or the whole group. Just noting once again, please put your questions in the chat and not specifically the Q&A, just because that's a little bit more difficult for us. And also virtually raise your hand. If you're physically raising your hand, there's a really high chance, there's a 100% chance I can't actually see it, unfortunately. So with this in mind, thank you guys so much. Oops, sorry. And yeah, I'm going to open it up to everybody. And let's see. We have any questions? And oh, if you don't know how to virtually raise your hand, I want to remind everyone, there should be a raise hand button, or you can go into the reaction section and there should be a raise hand button. The Q&A is turned off right now, but please put your message in the chat so everyone can see it. Make sure it goes to everybody. And then, yeah, we can go from there. Okay, I'm seeing a few questions pop in. Does Boston Harbor now participate in the National Working Waterfront Network? Yes. Boston Harbor now is a part of that National Working Waterfront Network, in that we receive sort of their emails. We're on their pan list. Additionally, everyone here on the panelists right now attended the most recent conference in San Diego. And so we were actually able to do a version of this panel previously in San Diego and shared all of our findings there as well. So thank you for sharing that resource. Additionally, if anyone else in the audience is interested in learning more about the National Working Waterfront Network, follow Abby's list and URL. So we have a question from Bud in the chat. How can we do the demand analysis needed to further determine the needs for DPAs?
I'm
Kelly?
happy to
Oh, sorry.
go ahead, Linda. Sorry.
I'm sorry, Alex. My understanding is that there are some, and I think Kelly Strong can answer this probably for us. There's an interest in having some public funding go toward that type of an analysis. But I'd love for Kelly Strong to elaborate on that. And I know, Kelly, if you're listening, our apologies at Boston Harbor Now for the technical problem we had with this particular presentation. please feel free to put it in the chat, and we could share more with the group later if you'd like. By
Kelly
hand.
Strong, if you want to talk, I can allow you to talk, but just raise your hand to let me know that that's something you're interested in. Okay, great. You should be allowed to talk now, Kelly.
Okay, well, thank you. Just first and foremost, I really want to thank the Waterfront Partners for undertaking this issue, which is extremely important to everybody from all different viewpoints. The state's economy, the resiliency challenges that we're facing. I think your study did an excellent job, and I really want to thank Alex. He was very, very helpful to the maritime industry sector and stakeholders I represent, along with the Maritime Alliance in defense of designated port areas. You engaged us. I can see in the report that you took a lot of our comments under consideration. They're highlighted in the report. It's really well done, and I want to thank all of you, Jason, John, Breanne, for doing this. Jill Horwood also from the Bar Foundation. As far as the question on funding, MATPA is pursuing to get something in the environmental economic bond bill, as far as getting money set aside to do this type of study that's needed on, the value of the maritime industry and how to put more attention on DPAs, and from a standpoint of not that they're a nuisance or that they're obstructing other projects, but how can we really promote and incentivize maritime industry to develop these properties while at the same time, making requirements for maritime industry to look at climate resiliency issues. Of course, any business owner that's going to invest in the DPA is going to be well aware of sea level rise and storm surge and those issues, and is going to do what is needed to protect their investment. And I'm not aware of any current maritime facility that isn't examining that and isn't also a good neighbor in terms of taking into consideration concerns of the abutting community and residents, as well as providing job training and programs to first and foremost to Boston area residents. There's several examples out there. So in summary, MAPA is pursuing this and is in discussions with a lot of the legislators and the governor's office on, putting a renewed focus. And we wholeheartedly support the recommendation of the Seaport Advisory Council really kind of being the group or the entity that's going to oversee this. There is, from my perspective, there's a mishmash of a lot of different things going on, and I think the lack of coordination is somewhat troubling to me, where you have studies going on separately at the Mystic River, lower Mystic River on the working waterfront. You have Boston doing its own study with the Armored Corps of Engineers. You have the state doing the resiliency, coastal resiliency initiative. Then you have CZM also doing its own reevaluation of the regs. Somebody needs to be overseeing all this, so there's coordination. There aren't conflicts that are going to pop up with findings and results and recommendations that are going to come out of each of these different studies that are going on. So again, thank you very much. I really encourage, it's a long report, it's 90 pages, but it's well worth the read. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Appreciate you stepping in. I'm going to grab another question from the chat from Zachary, and then Bud, I see that you have your hand raised, and I will call on you next. So Zachary would like to know, are there any studies about the impact of spot zoning on climate resilience and cadence? Alex, I think I'm going to pass this one to you.
Thanks. That's a good question. I'm only somewhat familiar with this topic. I know that Norfolk created multiple tiers of climate resilience zones in its city limits that offered design, sort of different levels of design guidelines to property owners in each of those tiers. And I think the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy has written more about this topic. So I can find their work and link it to you.
Cool. Thank you. All right, I'm going to pass it to Bud. Give me 1 second as I unmute you, or at least allow you to talk. Bud, you should be able to speak now if you unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, good morning, everybody. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on the demand question. I thought Jason laid out a really strong case for, we need two kinds of studies. One is a needs assessment locally, and then I think he was talking more broadly about a demand assessment, more broadly regionally, which gets at the question of how much DPA area do we actually need and what for at points in the future. The HR&A study had a very good recommendation in the recommendation section of the reports to look at future demand for DPAs. I guess it's too bad that wasn't done as the first phase of this study. Maybe it's a big multi-million-dollar project. I don't know, but I find a lot of what we're talking about is really abstract without really understanding what the demand is for DPAs in the future. And I'll give you 4 examples. Wind. You know, we talk a lot about the need for wind storage support and, you know, construction facilities along the ports. There's been a lot of studies done. Last I looked, I think there were 11 harbors under development for wind services of one kind or another. Is that enough, or are we going to need more? And if, you know, probably it's more than we need right now. And, you know, what's Boston's role in that in the future, if any? Maybe none. The future of a lot of fossil fuel facilities along the waterfront. There are tank farms in our area we saw in the photos earlier. Well, the city and the state have committed to get rid of fossil fuels completely. And, you know, if we're successful in doing that, that's going to free up a lot of land along the waterfront, not only here, but, you know, elsewhere along the coast. Third example is commercial fishing. It's this really sad story. I spend a lot of time in Gloucester. The lobsters are moving north. You know, what's the future of the fishing industry? There's very little of it left. And, you know, is that going to free up more land? Unfortunately. And then finally, I think we're facing a critical shortage of boat storage for the recreational sector. You know, if you have a boat, whether it's 20 feet or 40 feet or 100 feet, you get a letter in January from your place where you store it on land saying, you've got 4 days to tell us whether you want to be here, because if you don't, we have to give your space to somebody else. And, you know, that's a significant user of waterfront land. My point is just all these kinds of things need to be looked at, and we need to get away from the sort of abstract conversation about these DPAs and really look at what's the future and what do we need. And then just in case you can't get back to me again, technically, Kelly, my second question is, I was happy to see in the report there's a big focus on resilience, but there wasn't much about the particular problem in Border Street and elsewhere. And that is if you have fallow DPA area where there's no development planned, but it's a major flood pathway into the neighborhood. How do you deal with that problem, which is different from just protecting the port development itself in that area, but you got to protect everything inland. And I think that's a really big issue we have to focus on. Thank you.
Thanks, Bud. Appreciate those thoughts and comments. If anyone from the panel wants to sort of add additional thoughts, that's fine. But if not, Jamie has like a somewhat related question.
Well, just add one in terms of that thought and figuring out the future needs for the DPA. I think the need for data is definitely, because I know for, you know, the fishing industry has always been, you know, for the past 30 years or so, overfishing has been a concern, and there's a lot of question of whether the fish industry and the reality right now is, my understanding is they've run out of space. People are pretty cramped in at the fish pier now. So I don't see fishing and seafood has become bigger than ever. And we had gone to the Working Waterfront networking conference in San Diego, and a lot of the conversation there was sort of nothing that relates to Boston, because they were talking about people having these small sort of aquaculture operations and oysters and whatnot. And of course, aside from like stripers or other migratory fish coming into the harbor, you really wouldn't want to eat any of the fish that have been living in that muck. And so oysters and filter feeders are kind of off the table. But figuring out the demand for the future, this same conversation was going on many years ago when we started preserving farmland in Western Massachusetts. And people said, who the hell cares about these farms? We're never going to have farming here again because big industrial farms in the big square states out Midwest, that's where all the corn comes from. That's where everything comes from. You'll never have farming here again. And yet we preserve that farmland. And now we have sort of a proliferation of locally produced food. There's a whole movement in this, even to the point of talking about trying to produce things locally within Boston, which is unheard of. And so I think it's very hard to guess. It's very hard to predict the future of something that we have no clue what might come down the pike. So there is a sense of almost like land banking, of almost holding on to these lands in anticipation of some future use, which doesn't take away exactly what you're talking about on Border Street. Right now at Sunny Day Flooding, the Canada geese float into the parking lot right up to the loading dock of the Shaws. And that is not a tenable situation. There needs to be something done there, regardless of whether it's going to end up being a DPA approved use or what, but because it's a flood pathway into Central Square and all of East Boston. So while we are hemming and hawing about a solution and where things are going and who's going to pay for it, who's going to make the money off of it, the climate doesn't care. It's changing, and the sea is coming, and we need to do something. So that's going to force our hand on that decision. Exactly what the decision is going to be, I'm not sure, but I'm certainly hoping it includes a protective wall there with a reinforced, new pier that could handle some transit, basically ferry service, would be a big thing that I think we should be looking into in this realm.
Something else that I want to bring up is the Office of Coastal Zone Management is also conducting a DPA report, and I am hopeful that they'll have more of the statewide analysis that we need, and also hopefully maybe more of a needs analysis than we were able to do in this report. So keep an eye out for that. Hopefully, I think they're planning on having it out in the next couple of months.
Thank you both, John and Breanne. We do have another question from Jamie Fay, and then I'm going to pass it over to some of the raised hands. So Chris Mancini, I think you're next up in the raised hands. So question from Jamie Fay: what is unique about designated port areas in terms of resiliency that makes them different from other areas?
But I mean, it's the thing that makes them unique, and it's not necessarily a good thing right now, but for many of these properties that are sitting there vacant and unused, and as was voiced in one of the DPA boundary reviews in East Boston, one of the property owners said, listen, if I sell this now, I'm not going to get anything. I'd like it taken out so I could sell it for some real money. And that kind of straight talk was very refreshing, because it highlights what the situation is. Just pretend we get a big, the Mystic River Watershed Association call it Big Poppy, but a big storm hits the shoreline, and it hits South Boston, the waterfront. Picture it hitting like in 1988. And now, like the Channel Rock Club was basically all that was, in the post office, that was all that was over there. How much of a loss would you have taken if you owned all those parking lots? Not much. Now picture that same storm flooding that entire area. How much of a loss is going to happen? It's billions, because it's everything that's been invested in there, all the infrastructure, all the buildings, all the people living there, people paying off mortgages. So the thing that DPAs have going for them actually is the fact that, the issue that we're trying to address, they've been underinvested in, and they're artificially deflated in terms of their value, because they're limited to this one use that's not a whole lot of it out there. And so if they flood, you're not losing that much. I mean, the owner is losing a lot, but in terms of people having to bail out a number of condo owners, it's a lot less. So given the fact that there's this wiggle room in terms of the value, we should see that as an opportunity. I'm sure the owners aren't thinking of it as an opportunity. My property is worth less, but that means we should be able to leverage that difference in value to be able to figure out a way to do the financing to protect this thing. How can we bring the value into this property in a managed way that actually does not introduce additional risk to the owners, but actually we can shore up this property and make it economically viable. And that's going to take a lot of creative thinking and a lot of people working together. But that's my take on that question.
I also think that DPAs are in a unique position where, because a lot of parcels within DPAs are vacant, and a lot of parcels that actually have something on them have temporary use permits. They're not intended to be the permanent use of that parcel. There's a lot of opportunity to say, hey, we're going to regulate these parcels of land in a way that requires these resiliency measures, and we don't have to worry about, I guess, moving a giant apartment complex to accommodate these resilience measures. We can say, okay, we have this cold storage facility that we need to protect so that we can continue using it, but there's this buffer space. Who cares if it's super pretty because it's already closed to the public for security reasons? Let's just put resiliency measures there. I also think that it's important to remember that DPAs are the gateway to a lot of very vulnerable neighborhoods, and making DPAs resilient against climate change protects the neighborhoods behind them. So that's why I find it important to prioritize building resilience in DPAs.
Yeah, I agree with what John and Breanne have said. I think something else that's unique about DPAs, at Save the Harbor, we've been using this term development by dereliction, and the current limited opportunities that some landowners feel has led to a lot of the parcels in DPAs really being in bad shape. You know, we have kind of crumbling piers and infrastructure, and lots where the thought process might be, hey, if I kind of let this land get bad enough, no one's going to want it, and then it'll get taken out of the DPA, and then I can make some money, as John was talking about. And I think that is a unique situation that we see in DPAs that we don't necessarily see in non-DPA spaces around the harbor. And so I think that's another wrinkle to this as well.
Thank you all. All right. I want to make sure that we're getting to as many people as possible. So Chris Mancini, I'm going to allow you to talk and ask your question. I believe you just have to unmute.
Thanks, Kelly. Chris Mancini from Save the Harbor. I just saw Jake Citron's comment and question above. I hope you guys have time to get to that because I think it's a really good one. I'm trying to decide which of my questions to ask, but no, this is this is fantastic. I think one thing to think about is, and I want to hear what folks, I know most of you, but when it comes to public access, obviously that's something we're all really concerned with. It doesn't always coexist perfectly with these industrial uses or even non-industrial uses that rely on the water. But how can we, to Bud's point, take it out of the abstract and get really specific about understanding what our product line is, how much availability we have of these areas, and which ones need to remain restricted, and how we can incorporate opportunities for things like a harbor walk or parks and things like that can coexist with those uses that do rely on the waterfront.
Yeah, I'll hop in real quick. I'm glad that someone brought up the National Working Waterfront Network Conference, because although a lot of the discussions weren't necessarily related to the context we see in Boston, there were some really interesting ways to balance a working waterfront and public access. And some of you in this call might have heard of the wedge design guidelines that were originally launched in New York City around the Brooklyn Marine Terminal, but now have been kind of adopted as a national guideline that a lot of the top engineering and design firms are using. I'll just offer a super specific example that I found to be interesting, but in New York, they created a materials recovery facility, which is basically a recycling facility, and it is water dependent. There's barges that come and take, materials on and off that facility. And on the first glance, you would say, that's not necessarily a use that would accommodate public access. We don't want people walking around while these heavy machinery, there's safety issues. How they approached public access in this project was having like a small room that was used as kind of a museum, and they had students sign up for field trips to go there, right? And so you're still controlling who is in your facility, and you know at all times kind of where visitors might be. But this is an example of, maybe it's not, people going and touching the water and using a dock, but it's still connecting local communities to that parcel. And so people can learn more about what a working waterfront is. I think that's a big gap that I see, especially in conversations with community members in Chelsea. Recently, I went to La Colaborativa, and the youth there don't feel connected to that DPA at all. And so if you have programs like this, where you're allowing some sort of access into the working waterfront, I think that goes a long way also towards the workforce development that's really needed for these industries as well.
Yeah, I think we've got some good examples where we've, for 20 plus years, we're fighting with Eastern Minerals, and we actually reached sort of a point of détente and worked with them and their architect at Landing Studios to really see a benefit for the community, where they had purchased a former tank farm and were expanding their salt operations into it. And what they ended up doing was calculating out the square footage of what a waterfront walkway would have been under like a Chapter 91 sort of permit, and saying, well, this is a DPA, we can't have people walking through here because this is where we're offloading salt, but we can take all that square footage, push it down the end of our property, and because we can't make a park, we're going to make a publicly oriented recreational territory, was what the acronym came out to, PORT. And so the Port Park in Chelsea is a year-round space that is a beautiful little park. They maintain it. But then the best example of that living with industry is actually the adjacent property between this small park and the salt facility is a paved surface that during the summertime, the salt is scraped off of it. There are barriers put up, and they have events there. We hold our fundraiser there. That'll be in August for those of you who are waiting for it. And they have basketball courts set up there. Kids use it. It's in a very active space in the summer. And then in the winter, when no one really wants to be down there, and they have their operations in full swing, they reclaim that paved surface and they have it for salt storage. So that is one way, a very physical, real way of sharing space with an industrial use. I think other sort of more integrated ways of doing the same thing would be something like the Harpoon Brewery over in South Boston, where you've got and it's in the industrial area. It's an industrial use. They're brewing things there, but then you've got a tasting room people are going to. I mean, the shipyard in East Boston has well, everything seems for me circles around alcohol. I don't know, but there's a cider brewery there, as well as the ICA, so art. But then you have the other facilities that are in there that are marine industrial related, as well as the boats that are all docked there. So there are a lot of ways that we can combine these things together. And I think the more that we can do that in a creative way, and potentially, and I know this has been proposed in other scenarios, of having the second floor, third floor of an industrial building being used for something else, and the first floor being the actual industrial use and working in the yard. Thinking of things like that would be a way to inject some economic life into a property while still maintaining it as an industrial use where it counts.
Thanks, John. All right, we have time for 2 more questions. Kelly, I see that you have your hand raised, and Jake, you put a question in the chat, as Chris mentioned. We're going to go to Jake's, and then we're going to Kelly's, and then fortunately, we're probably going to run out of time. So Jake has a very long question, but I've been trying to think of how to summarize in my head. But essentially, a seafood processing facility is considered a water-dependent industrial use according to sort of designated port area rules. We see a lot of those in sort of South Boston. But if they primarily use truck, are they actually a water-dependent use? And should they be considered part of like protection by DPAs? And then if the answer is that they shouldn't, are DPAs just being used for like urban industrial policies in general as like a substitute? And then how does it benefit industrial job creation to relegate these businesses to waterfront properties that are relative to inland properties far more expensive to develop, on more complicated to operate from given competing land uses, climate change, and many other factors? Jake, I'm so sorry. Your question's very long, but I hope I captured that pretty summarily. But for anyone looking, it is in the chat.
I think that this question highlights a very real gap in the regulations as they exist today, and is a good demonstration of why we need to revisit what is considered an allowed use under a DPA and what uses should be prioritized in DPAs. I also think that issues such as like seafood processors that don't take seafood off of ships, as Jake highlights, could be better suited for a transitional zone, could be better suited to not be in a DPA at all. Who knows? But we need to be having these conversations with all stakeholders involved, and we need regulatory reform to answer these questions and to really make better policy around what our working waterfront looks like.
Yeah, I'll just add into that, the specifically to his question relates back to the answer I gave about the what's unique about DPAs. And the unique thing about DPAs is that the property values are so much lower. So if you're looking for an industrial use, I mean, the reason why a lot of these legacy industrial uses are on these properties is because they were like these landfill areas, and you either got industrial or you got housing projects. So landfill usually relates to being like low quality land, like years ago. And so these things were filled in and different industrial uses put in there. If you were to try to find industrial, I mean, it's very hard to find land within 495 now. That's not ludicrously expensive. So relative to finding industrial properties where, unless you're doing, you know, De Beers diamonds or something, it's very hard to get a return, you know, for an industrial use. It makes, that's why so much of our manufacturing has gone south, like literally. It's gone out to other places where there's more land and it's cheaper. So the only place around Boston where there's large tracts of land that are cheap are the ones that have these restrictions on them. So it's kind of a catch-22. I've got a warehouse operation. I need cheap land and a whole lot of it. And what do you know? Here's the land that's cheap and there's a lot of it, but it also has to be marine industrial. The other thing, in addition to the DPA zoning, would be what is the level of remediation that's going to be needed on these properties due to the legacy of the industrial stuff on it. And usually it's only things like casinos that have the pockets deep enough to justify the kind of cleanups that are needed.
I'll quickly add that, you know, this is also a question of the discrepancy in governance between the state and the city. The DPAs were sort of created to solve a state level economic development problem. Whereas, you know, this is a question of municipal economic development and industrial development planning. And I think one of the reasons why the 1996 collaboration between the Boston Redevelopment Authority and Massport and others was so exciting was that that was an example of sort of inter-sector, local and state collaboration on an industrial development vision. But I think any sort of significant investment in this plan will start having to ask questions about other sites outside the DPAs and their suitability for industrial activity. It's not a perfect corollary at all, But last year, New York City announced a plan that was initially focused on industrial business zones, or IBZs. They're not like DPAs at all, but they're specific zones across the city that are sort of limited mostly to industrial uses. And the DCP, Department of City Planning of New York City, realized that a significant portion of in manufacturing, warehouse, industrial activity in New York City was actually outside of these IBCs. And so they had to completely redo the plan and rescope it. And now it's a citywide industrial plan. And so I think opening the conversation about DPAs in a way that's sort of bringing together local and state stakeholders will probably open a broader question in the same way.
Thank you, guys. Go ahead, Jason, really
30
quick.
seconds. Yeah. I think the core of your question, Jake, is what needs to be on the water, right? Like what is actually water dependent? And I think something that's been interesting for me is realizing there's a lot of things that are water dependent that aren't necessarily water dependent industrial uses, right? And that things like community sailing centers and recreational marinas, they need to be on the water. Small aquaculture, maybe not in the Boston Harbor, but in our other DPAs, where, you know, things like housing or any type of processing that's only using trucks, that doesn't necessarily need to be on the water. So wanted to kind of throw that in there as well.
Thanks, Jason, and everyone for your thoughts. Kelly, you were the last question. We only have 1 minute left, so hopefully we can answer it quickly. You can feel free to unmute yourself. You should have the ability to do that.
Have you? I don't see it. Am I unmuted?
We can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me? All right, just real quick, my question had to go towards, in the report, there were recommendations of looking at some new innovative ways to use DPA, such as blue tech and whatnot. I'd really be interested if any of the panelists could send me some more information. My knowledge on that area is very limited, but I know my contingency of traditional maritime users really view the blue tech stuff as a bunch of scientists basically spending most of their time in a lab, and then maybe once a week or once a month going down to the water to get a sample or test something. And so it's not the same as what we traditionally do in terms of importing, exporting cargoes and of that nature. So I'd really like to learn more. If I could just say one more thing, is that as we all move forward, there are a lot of smart people on this call with a lot of different viewpoints. And I really encourage, and I really try to promote this through the Boston Shipping Association and MATBA, that we all need to work together. Otherwise, we're going to be fighting each other. And I think collaboration and sharing information and bouncing ideas is really important. I try to do that when I can with groups, because we need to understand each other's goals and objectives. Maybe we might not agree necessarily, but we need to work together, or else we're just going to be battling each other. And I really encourage that we try to do the best we can. We might not get everything we want, but we all can work together to get something. And I really think that's important. So that's it. Thank you again for hosting this.
Thank you, Kelly. And Kelly, this actually is a great segue into sort of my outro. This Harbor Use Public Forum is one in a series of 3. The next Harbor Use Public Forums will be going deeper into sort of the different technologies, not technologies, but businesses, etc. I know Massport, for example, was willing to talk to us about blue tech. And so we will be bringing in more people to have more discussions so that we can all come together and sort of talk and share different perspectives about the working waterfront and how we handle this moving forward. So agree with everything that you just said, and thank you guys for taking the time to be here. Thank you all of the attendees for being here. We really appreciate you taking an extra 1.5 minutes to sort of stick around and finish the conversation. And I want to give a special thank you to all of the panelists and the presenters. Thank you, Alex, Breanne, Jason, John. Your time has been deeply appreciated, and we've really loved hearing your perspectives. Once again, this is one part in a 3-part series, so stick around and follow Boston Harbor Now to find out when the next Harbor Use Public Forums are happening. Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you guys have a lovely afternoon and go have some lunch.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you all.
Thanks.